These things jump, and that means there's something inside. So I took one out of the little square box and got my tweezers ready. But I never expected these things to actually hatch into something. Allow me to explain that initially I thought these were just beans. I didn't believe something living could be inhabiting the bean. So, to find out for myself, I decided to open one up to see what actually lived inside. And to my surprise, it was this thing. I couldn't believe that peeling back the layers of this supposed bean revealed to me a living, breathing worm? Well, it was in that moment that I had a plan. Instead of just letting these things die, I was gonna keep them safe and give them a proper environment to hatch from a little worm into, well, I guess we were gonna see what they were gonna turn into. Would it be a butterfly, a moth, a creepy crawler? But this tiny little transparent worm with a unique orange head seemed like it was kinda angry about being opened up. Because after I opened the bean, something I never expected started to happen. It started to bite the edges of the bean, and as the other closed beans continued to snap, crackle, and pop in that little square box, the open bean with the little worm inside looked like it was starting to weave a net around the part of the bean that I opened to actually close the structure altogether. Well, a few hours passed, and this is what the bean started to look like. I guess it was basically telling me that I should have left the beans closed because this little worm wanted to stay inside. And as this little thing seemingly continued to close up the bean, I learned that these beans are actually found in Mexico. They're called Mexican jumping beans, and they're small bean pods of a host plant. Female moths lay eggs that get deposited inside the bean, and as the little larvae grow, the bean hardens and falls to the ground, and the movement inside by the little worm contracting and relaxing and growing is what makes these things pop on the floor. It's the heat from the sun or heat from body temperature, like from holding the beans in your hands for a few minutes, that also makes the larvae start to wiggle and bounce as a way of surviving and going through their metamorphosis. Well, slowly but surely, as time passed, the bean was almost fully secured and closed back up. And as it continued to close the entirety of the bean, honestly, I began to wonder how these things even survive in there, since the little beans are such a tiny environment for such a small little thing to thrive in. And I was also wondering how they consume their food if they're stuck inside a little bean. But then I learned that the larvae primarily consume the nutrients present in the seed, and their feeding activity triggers the movement of the jumping bean. And then it all started to make sense as to why the little worm was moving around and eating the little hair-like structures on the bean, in addition to closing it up with silk threading. That silk threading, I later learned, is a special thread that the worm produces using glands in their heads. And they use this silk for a few things, like creating insulated shelters to stay warm from colder temperatures, or to secure a protective place to stay out of harm's way from potential creatures who can eat them, like squirrels or bunnies. And they also use it as a place to live so they can begin their metamorphosis process from a tiny larvae all the way up to a chrysalis. And at that point, I thought, well, are these things silkworms? But they aren't silkworms that turn into silk moths, but rather, they're houseworms that turn into house moths. I bet you that if you had enough of this webbing, you could still make things out of it. But apparently the webbing from house moths is a lot weaker than that of the silk from a silk moth. So the silk threads they produce cannot be used for human purposes like the silk obtained from silkworms being used to make things like silk for clothing. But it is a fact that the silk threads that the house moths produce to close the bean that I opened do in fact play a really vital role in their survival. Well, I needed to validate if this process was just being done by a fluke or luck of the draw, so I opened another bean up to see if the next one would also close the bean up, and sure enough, the exact same thing happened. I watched as the little one closed up the bean with these little silk threads, and it was truly an amazing phenomenon that I was excited to witness. And at this point, after realizing something living was truly inside, I needed to know what was next for these little ones. I wanted to know what exactly they turn into and what type of metamorphosis they go through. So I put the 5 beans in my bug box, the 2 that we opened and the other 3 that we left closed, and I waited for a long time 5 months to be exact. It got to a point where I was quite nervous that these things would never get to the next stage of their lives because 5 months is a long time for nothing to happen. I wasn't sure how long it would take, but from hatching other animals, I do know that it can take anywhere from a few weeks to several months. So I tried to be as patient as possible for these little ones. And listen, if this taught me anything, it showed me that patience is a virtue, and I was right to wait on them, and it's a good thing I had a time lapse rolling on them too. Because even after such a long time, one day I woke up and realized that there was a tiny little baby moth inside the bug box. And after reviewing the time-lapse footage, I realized that it created an exit hole on one side of the bean and finally, after 5 months, hatched. As I admired this tiny creature that I waited so long for, I learned that the moth larvae stay inside the bean until they reach maturity, and it's true that once they're fully developed inside the bean, the adult moth chews a small hole through the bean's outer shell, emerging as a tiny cute moth to continue its life cycle. And after the moth emerges, then it looks for a mate to lay eggs and continue the Mexican jumping bean life cycle. And let me tell you that this was the cutest, tiniest, daintiest little creature I ever saw. And it was exciting that I was there the entire journey throughout its metamorphosis. And honestly, I've gotta admit that this was the weirdest way to learn about why Mexican jumping beans actually jump, and also the coolest way to learn about the metamorphosis of a house moth. Nature is so weird. And now, the only thing left to do here is wait for the rest of these things to hatch, and then maybe, just maybe, we can continue the life cycle and get these ladies pregnant.
And they don't stop for a long time.
What is going on here?